The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 3-year-old Marcus Thompson carefully arranged his colorful wooden blocks on his grandmother's weathered front porch. His chubby fingers worked with the intense concentration only a toddler could muster, building what he proudly called the biggest tower in the whole world. The blocks clicked together in a satisfying rhythm, red on blue, yellow on green, while Marcus hummed his favorite nursery rhyme under his breath. Grandma Eleanor Thompson watched from her kitchen window, a warm smile creasing her 72-year-old face as she dried the breakfast dishes. Marcus had been staying with her for 2 weeks, while his mother, Sarah, worked double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. Eleanor didn't mind the company. If anything, the house felt more alive with Marcus's infectious giggles and endless chatter about dinosaurs, trucks, and his imaginary friend named Mr. Pancake. "Marcus, sweetie, don't go past the steps," Eleanor called through the screen door, her voice carrying that gentle authority that grandmothers perfected over decades. Marcus nodded seriously, his dark curls bouncing as he added another block to his architectural masterpiece. The tower now stood nearly as tall as he was, a precarious monument to childhood determination. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. Most folks had already left for work, leaving behind the familiar sounds of suburban life, a dog barking in the distance, the rhythmic whir of Mrs. Patterson's sprinkler system next door, and the occasional rumble of delivery trucks navigating the narrow streets. The rundown Riverside apartments across the street stood like a tired giant, its brick facade stained with years of neglect and broken dreams. Marcus was reaching for a particularly elusive green block when the shouting began. At first, it sounded like the usual neighborhood drama, maybe someone complaining about a parking spot or a loud television. But the voices grew louder, more aggressive, cutting through the peaceful morning air like broken glass. Marcus looked up from his blocks, his innocent brown eyes scanning the street with curiosity rather than concern. 2 men had emerged from the side entrance of the apartment complex, their body language tense and threatening. The larger man wore a bright red jacket that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, his massive frame towering over his companion. Even from across the street, Marcus could see the man's face was twisted with anger, his mouth moving rapidly as he gestured wildly with his hands. The second man was smaller, wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt, backing away with his hands raised in what looked like surrender. His voice carried across the street, pleading and desperate. "Come on, Ray, we can work this out. I've got your money, man. Just give me another week." Marcus tilted his head, the way children do when they encounter something beyond their understanding. Adults sometimes raised their voices. He knew that much. Mommy and Daddy used to yell before Daddy went away. But this felt different, dangerous, in a way that made his little stomach flutter with unease. The man in the red jacket raised stepped closer to his victim, his voice dropping to a menacing growl that somehow seemed more frightening than the shouting. "You think I'm stupid, David? You think you can just keep lying to me?" He reached behind his back and pulled out something long and metallic, a piece of pipe that gleamed dully in the morning light. Marcus's tower of blocks forgotten, he watched with the horrible fascination of a child who doesn't yet understand that some things should not be seen. His small hands gripped the porch railing as the scene unfolded like a nightmare in broad daylight. "Please, Ray, don't," David's plea was cut short as Raymond Hayes raised the pipe above his head. The metal connected with David's skull with a sound that would haunt Marcus's dreams for weeks to come, a wet, terrible crack that seemed to echo off every building on Maple Street. Blood sprayed across the concrete in a crimson arc, and David Martinez crumpled to the ground like a discarded puppet, his body convulsing once before going terrifyingly still. For a moment that felt like hours, the world went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Marcus stood frozen on the porch, his 3-year-old mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, his lungs forgetting how to work. Raymond Hayes stood over David's motionless form, the bloody pipe still clutched in his massive fist. He looked around frantically, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. That's when his eyes found Marcus. Their gazes locked across the 30 feet of asphalt and fear that separated them. Hayes's expression shifted from rage to something even more terrifying: cold calculation. He stared at the small boy on the porch with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Marcus felt something dark and adult pass between them, a silent message that his young mind couldn't interpret, but his body understood instinctively. Run! Marcus stumbled backward, his small legs tangling as he scrambled through the screen door and into the safety of his grandmother's house. His blocks scattered across the porch, forgotten remnants of innocence. Behind him, he heard the screech of tires as Hayes fled the scene, leaving David Martinez bleeding and broken on the concrete. Eleanor found Marcus 20 minutes later, curled in a tight ball under his bed, his teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles, clutched against his chest like armor. His whole body shook with silent sobs, and when she tried to coax him out with promises of cookies and cartoons, he only whispered 4 words that would change everything. Bad man hurt him. By the time the ambulance arrived, sirens wailing through the morning air, Marcus had retreated so far into himself that he seemed to have forgotten how to speak at all. Eleanor held him close as paramedics worked frantically to save David's life. But the little boy who had been chattering about dinosaurs just an hour earlier now communicated only in trembles and tears. The biggest tower in the whole world lay in ruins on the porch, its colorful blocks scattered like broken dreams. But the real destruction was invisible, buried deep in the mind of a 3-year-old who had seen too much, too soon, and would carry the weight of that terrible morning long after the physical evidence was swept away. Detective Sarah Mitchell had interviewed hundreds of witnesses in her 15-year career, but she had never felt more helpless than she did sitting across from Marcus Thompson in the child-friendly interview room at Cleveland Police Department. The walls were painted cheerful yellow, decorated with cartoon animals and alphabet posters, but the 3-year-old boy seemed oblivious to the room's attempts at warmth. He sat rigid in a tiny plastic chair, his legs barely reaching the floor, staring at his hands folded in his lap, like he was studying a puzzle only he could see. "Hey there, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice dropping to the gentle tone she reserved for the most fragile witnesses. She had changed out of her usual business attire into jeans and a soft sweater, hoping to appear less intimidating. "I like your dinosaur shirt. Is that a T-Rex?" No response. Marcus didn't even glance up at the bright green shirt his grandmother had picked out, the one he'd been so excited about just a week ago. His dark eyes remained fixed downward, his small body so still he barely seemed to be breathing. Sarah tried again, pulling out a coloring book and a fresh box of crayons. "Would you like to draw something for me? I bet you're a really good artist." She slid the supplies across the small table, but Marcus recoiled as if they might bite him. His chair scraped against the floor as he pressed himself backward, seeking distance from anything that might require him to engage with the world around him. Behind the one-way mirror, Dr. James Chun observed every micro-expression, every flinch and withdrawal. The child psychologist had reviewed Marcus's case file extensively, noting Eleanor Thompson's description of her grandson's dramatic personality change following the incident. According to his grandmother, Marcus had gone from an endlessly chatty, curious child to a ghost who barely acknowledged his own name. "This level of regression is severe," Dr. Chun murmured to Lieutenant Patricia Reeves, who stood beside him, watching the painful interview. "The child has essentially shut down all external communication as a protective mechanism. His mind is trying to lock away the trauma, but in doing so, It's also locking away his ability to help us understand what he witnessed. Lieutenant Reeves frowned, her weathered face showing the strain of a case that seemed to be slipping away from them. We need his testimony, Doc. Without it, Raymond Hayes walks free, and David Martinez's family never gets justice. The victim is still in a coma, and we don't have any other reliable witnesses. A few neighbors heard shouting, but nobody else actually saw the attack. In the interview room, Sarah had moved to the floor, sitting cross-legged in front of Marcus's chair. She spoke in barely above a whisper, sharing stories about her own childhood. Her pet cat named Whiskers, anything to build some kind of connection. But Marcus remained unreachable, trapped behind walls of fear and confusion his young mind had constructed for survival. Sometimes when scary things happen, Sarah said carefully, it helps to talk about them. Kind of like when you have a bad dream, and telling someone about it makes it less scary. She watched for any flicker of recognition, any sign that her words were penetrating the silence. You don't have to be afraid, sweetie. You're safe here with us. For just a moment, Marcus's eyes darted upward, meeting hers for perhaps a second before quickly looking away. But in that brief glimpse, Sarah saw something that made her chest tighten with empathy, not just fear, but guilt. Somehow, this little boy believed he had done something wrong by witnessing the attack. Meanwhile, across town at the Cuyahoga County Jail, Raymond Hayes sat in his cell with the smug confidence of a man who knew the system's weaknesses. His public defender, Michael Crawford, had already explained the prosecution's predicament during their meeting that morning. They've got nothing solid, Crawford had said, reviewing the thin case file. Some circumstantial evidence, your past record, but their star witness is a traumatized toddler who won't talk. Even if they get him to say something, I can tear apart. A 3-year-old's testimony in 5 minutes. Childhood memories are notoriously unreliable. Hayes smiled coldly, remembering the moment he'd locked eyes with the little boy across the street. He'd been furious at David for trying to shortchange him on a drug payment, and the pipe had been handy. But seeing that kid on the porch had been a complication he hadn't anticipated. Now, it seemed like that complication was solving itself. Back at Eleanor Thompson's house that evening, the elderly woman sat at her kitchen table, watching Marcus pick at his dinner. The boy who used to chatter constantly about his day, his toys, his elaborate stories about Mr. Pancake, now ate in complete silence. She had tried everything: his favorite foods, favorite cartoons, even calling his mother at work so he could hear her voice. Nothing seemed to reach him. Marcus, honey, Eleanor said softly, reaching across the table to touch his small hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't respond either. Grandma loves you so much. You know that, right? The closest thing to communication she'd gotten in 5 days was when Marcus had drawn a picture the day after the incident, crude crayon marks showing 2 stick figures, one much larger than the other, with red scribbles between them. When she'd asked him about the drawing, he had torn it up and thrown the pieces away, then retreated to his hiding spot under the bed. Dr. Chon arrived at the house just as Eleanor was trying to coax Marcus into his bedtime routine. The child psychologist had requested a home visit to observe Marcus in his familiar environment, hoping to understand the full scope of his trauma response. Has he been sleeping? Dr. Chun asked, noting the dark circles under Marcus's eyes. Barely, Eleanor replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. He has nightmares every night. I hear him crying, but when I go to check on him, he pretends to be asleep. Sometimes I find him under the bed again, like he's trying to hide from the whole world. Dr. Chun knelt down to Marcus's eye level, moving slowly and speaking in calm, measured tones. Hello, Marcus. I'm Dr. Chun. I help children when they're feeling scared or sad. He pulled out a small stuffed elephant from his bag. This is Peanut. He's very good at listening to secrets. Would you like to hold him? Marcus glanced at the elephant briefly, and for a moment, Dr. Chun thought he might reach for it. But instead, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into his grandmother's bedroom where he could hide under the bed once more. He's protecting himself, Dr. Chun explained to Eleanor as they watched the small figure retreat. His mind has created a safe space, but unfortunately, that space doesn't include communication with the outside world. Traditional interview techniques are actually making him withdraw further. We need to find a different approach, or we may lose our only witness forever. As night fell over Maple Street, Marcus lay curled beneath his grandmother's bed, clutching Mr. Snuggles and listening to the adults talking in worried voices in the next room. He understood more than they knew. He knew they wanted him to talk about the bad man with the red jacket. But every time he tried to remember, his chest felt tight and his hands shook, and the only safe place seemed to be in the darkness under the bed, where bad men with pipes couldn't find him. The case was slipping away, one silent day at a time. The emergency meeting in Judge Robert Coleman's chambers felt more like a funeral than a strategy session. District Attorney Patricia Huang sat at the polished mahogany table, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain loose, strands of hair escaping her perfect bun, worry lines etched deeper around her eyes. Across from her, Detective Sarah Mitchell slumped in her chair, the weight of failure heavy on her shoulders. 2 weeks had passed since Marcus Thompson had witnessed the brutal attack, and they were no closer to getting him to speak than on Day 1. We're running out of time, Da Huang said, her voice tight with frustration. Hayes's lawyer is already filing motions to dismiss. Without Marcus's testimony, we have circumstantial evidence at best. A few neighbors heard arguing. We have some blood spatter analysis, but nothing that definitively puts Hayes at the scene with the weapon. Dr. James Chun adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, reviewing his notes from multiple failed sessions with Marcus. The child has developed what we call selective mutism as a trauma response. Every attempt to discuss the incident triggers a fight or flight response. Traditional play therapy, art therapy, even hypnosis techniques designed for children, nothing is working. He's essentially locked the memory away so deeply that accessing it may cause more psychological damage. Judge Coleman, a 40-year veteran of the bench, had presided over thousands of cases, but few had frustrated him as much as this one. So we're supposed to let a violent criminal walk free because a 3-year-old can't testify? There has to be another way. That's when Lisa Rodriguez, the victim advocate who had been quietly observing from the corner, cleared her throat. All eyes turned to the petite woman in her 30s, whose gentle demeanor often masked a fierce determination to protect the vulnerable. There might be something we haven't considered, Lisa said, pulling out her tablet. I've been researching innovative approaches to helping traumatized child witnesses. There's a program in Seattle, another in Denver, and one just started in Tampa. They're using specially trained therapy animals to help children feel safe enough to communicate. Detective Mitchell looked skeptical. You mean like emotional support? Animals? More than that, Lisa explained, scrolling through research papers and case studies. These are highly trained courthouse facility dogs, specifically educated to work with trauma victims. The theory is that children often find it easier to talk to animals than adults, especially when they're scared or confused. The animals provide a non-judgmental presence that can help break through psychological barriers. Dr. Chun leaned forward with interest. I've read about animal-assisted therapy, but in a courtroom setting? That seems unprecedented. It is, at least in Ohio, Lisa admitted. But the results in other states have been remarkable. There's a case in Colorado where a 5-year-old who witnessed domestic violence was completely nonverbal for months. After working with a trained golden retriever for just 2 weeks, she was able to testify and helped convict her abuser. Da Huang frowned, her prosecutor's mind already racing through potential legal obstacles. What about admissibility? Defense attorneys would have a field day arguing that a dog in the courtroom is prejudicial, designed to manipulate jury emotions. The precedent exists, Lisa countered, pulling up legal documents. Courts in 12 states have allowed facility dogs for child witnesses under specific protocols. The key is that the animal provides therapeutic support, not emotional manipulation. Strict guidelines ensure the dog doesn't influence testimony. They're trained to remain calm and neutral, regardless of what's being discussed. Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. You're seriously suggesting I allow a dog in my courtroom? Not just any dog, Lisa said passionately. I've already contacted canine companions for independence in Columbus. They have a 4-year-old golden retriever named Bella, who's been working with the Victim Services Unit there. She's completed over 200 hours of specialized training courtroom protocols, trauma response, even how to remain completely still during testimony. Her handler, Officer Maria Santos, has a master's degree in social work and 3 years of experience with the program. The room fell silent as everyone processed this unconventional proposal. Outside the windows, April rain drummed against the glass, matching the tension in the air. Detective Mitchell was the first to speak. What would the process look like? Lisa had clearly done her homework. First, we'd arrange a controlled meeting between Marcus and Bella in a neutral environment. No pressure, no questions about the case, just letting them get acquainted. If Marcus responds positively, we gradually introduce more structured interactions. The goal isn't to force him to talk about the trauma, but to help him feel safe enough that communication becomes possible again. Dr. Chun nodded slowly, his clinical mind working through the possibilities. From a psychological standpoint, it actually makes sense. Children often form faster bonds with animals than with adult authority figures. Animals don't have hidden agendas, they don't judge, and they provide unconditional comfort. For a child who's lost trust in the adult world, a dog might represent the safety he desperately needs. But what if it doesn't work? Dahuang asked. We're already running out of time before trial. If this therapy dog approach fails, we'll have wasted weeks we don't have. Then we're no worse off than we are now, Judge Coleman said pragmatically. Right now, we have a witness who won't speak. If this gives us even a chance of reaching him, I think we have to try. Lisa felt a surge of hope. I can have Bella and Officer Santos here by Thursday for an initial assessment. We'll set up the meeting at the Family Advocacy Center, completely informal. No legal personnel present, except maybe Dr. Chun to observe. What about the family? Detective Mitchell asked. The grandmother will need to consent, and she's already been through hell watching her grandson suffer. Eleanor Thompson loves that boy more than life itself, Dr. Chun said quietly. When I explained that traditional therapy methods weren't helping, she begged me to find another way. She said she'd try anything to get her happy little grandson back. Judge Coleman made his decision with the authority that had served him. Well, for 4 decades, contact this Columbus facility. Set up the meeting. But I want strict protocols in place, no media attention, no pressure on the child. And if there's any sign this is causing additional trauma, we stop immediately. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Lisa Rodriguez remained behind, staring out the rain-streaked window. She thought about Marcus Thompson, hiding under his grandmother's bed, and David Martinez, still unconscious in his hospital room. Somewhere between a traumatized child's silence and a violent criminal's freedom stood a golden retriever named Bella, carrying hopes that seemed almost too fragile to bear. But sometimes, Lisa had learned in her years of advocacy work, the most fragile hopes were also the strongest. Sometimes salvation came not from complex legal strategies or sophisticated therapy techniques, but from the simple, uncomplicated love between a child and a dog. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. The Family Advocacy Center on East 9th Street had been designed with children in mind, soft pastel walls, comfortable furniture scaled to small bodies, and large windows that let in natural light. But as Eleanor Thompson guided Marcus through the front door on that Thursday morning, the 3-year-old seemed oblivious to the welcoming environment. He clutched his grandmother's hand with desperate intensity, his eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. "It's okay, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her own voice betraying the anxiety she was trying to hide. 2 weeks of watching her grandson retreat further into himself had aged her years. The vibrant little boy who used to greet each morning with excitement and endless questions had become a shadow, barely eating, rarely sleeping, and still refusing to speak about what he'd witnessed. Officer Maria Santos waited in the main playroom with Bella at her side. At 34, Maria had the kind of warm, patient demeanor that came from years of working with trauma victims. Her shoulder-length dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes to appear less intimidating: jeans, sneakers, and a soft blue sweater that complemented Bella's golden coat. Bella herself was magnificent. 4-year-old golden retriever with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. She sat perfectly still beside Maria's chair, her training evident in every aspect of her posture. This was no ordinary pet, but a highly specialized therapeutic tool with over 200 hours of courtroom and trauma response training. Dr. Chun observed from a corner chair, his notebook ready to document Marcus's reactions. He had seen many therapeutic interventions in his career, but he'd never worked with a facility dog before. The scientific literature was promising, but every child was different, and Marcus's trauma responses had been particularly severe. When Marcus first entered the room and saw Bella, something remarkable happened. For the first time in 2 weeks, he stopped walking. Not in fear or withdrawal, but in genuine curiosity. His grip on Eleanor's hand loosened slightly as he stared at the beautiful dog sitting so calmly across the room. "Hello, Marcus," Maria said softly, not moving from her position. "This is my friend Bella. She's very gentle, and she loves meeting new people. Would you like to say hi to her?" Marcus didn't respond verbally, but his body language shifted in ways that made Dr. Chun lean forward with interest. The rigid tension in the boy's shoulders eased fractionally, and his breathing became less shallow. More importantly, he took a half-step forward instead of backward, the first time since the incident that he'd moved towards something instead of away from it. Bella, with the intuitive wisdom that made her exceptional at her job, seemed to sense Marcus's fragile emotional state. She remained perfectly still, but allowed her tail to give the tiniest of wags, just enough to show friendliness without appearing overwhelming or energetic. "Bella knows lots of tricks," Maria continued in her soothing voice. "She can sit and stay and shake hands. She's very smart, but right now she's just waiting to see if you'd like to be her friend." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her grandson take another tentative step forward. "It's okay, Marcus," she whispered. "A pretty doggy wants to meet you." What happened next would be talked about in the Family Advocacy Center for years to come. Marcus, the child who had been mute and withdrawn for weeks, suddenly broke free from his grandmother's hand and walked directly to Bella. He stopped just out of reach and tilted his head, studying her with the intense focus only children possessed. "Hi, doggy," he whispered, so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear him. But those 2 words, the first voluntary speech he'd produced since the incident, sent waves of hope through the room. Bella, responding to some signal only she could detect, slowly lowered herself to the floor, making herself smaller and less intimidating. She rested her chin on her paws and looked up at Marcus with patient, loving eyes that seemed to say, "I have all day to wait for you." Marcus giggled, actually giggled, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He reached out one small hand and gently touched Bella's soft ears, then snatched his hand back as if surprised by his own boldness. But when Bella remained perfectly calm and simply wagged her tail a little more enthusiastically, Marcus grew braver. "She's soft," he announced to the room, his voice stronger now. "Like my teddy bear, but warmer." Maria carefully pulled a tennis ball from her pocket. "Would you like to see Bella catch?" she asked. Marcus nodded eagerly, the first clear affirmative response he'd given to an adult in 2 weeks. The next hour passed like magic. Marcus laughed as Bella performed simple tricks, clapped when she successfully caught the ball, and even attempted to give her commands of his own. "Sit, Bella," he said with 3-year-old authority, beaming with pride. When she immediately complied, Dr. Chon's notebook filled with observations. Subject engaging in sustained eye contact with animal. Spontaneous laughter observed. Initiating physical contact and verbal communication. Marked decrease in hypervigilance behaviors. But the most significant moment came when Marcus, emboldened by an hour of successful interaction, curled up on the floor beside Bella and rested his head against her side. "She's my friend," he announced sleepily. "She makes the scary feelings go away." Meanwhile, across town in the offices of Crawford and Associates, defense attorney Michael Crawford was having a very different kind of meeting with his client, Raymond. Hayes sat in the consultation room with the cocky confidence of a man who believed the system was about to work in his favor. "So the kid still isn't talking?" Hayes asked, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Crawford nodded, though he looked less pleased than his client. "The prosecution is getting desperate. I heard through the grapevine they're trying some experimental therapy approach, but my sources say it's not working. The trial is scheduled to begin in 3 weeks, and without the boy's testimony, they've got nothing solid." "What about the victim? Martinez still in a coma?" "Yes, and even if he wakes up, the head trauma was severe. His memory of the incident will likely be compromised." Crawford leaned forward. "But Ray, I need you to understand something. If that kid does start talking—" "He won't," Hayes interrupted coldly. "Little kids forget things. They get confused. And even if he does remember, who's going to believe a 3-year-old over circumstantial evidence?" Crawford wasn't so sure. He'd been practicing law for 20 years, and he'd learned never to underestimate the power of a sympathetic witness, especially a child. But for now, time seemed to be on their side. Back at the Family Advocacy Center, the session was winding down. Marcus had spent the entire afternoon with Bella, and the transformation was remarkable. The withdrawn, frightened child who had entered that morning was now chattering excitedly about his new friend, asking when he could see her again. "Can Bella come to Grandma's house?" Marcus asked hopefully. Maria smiled gently. "Bella has special work to do, Marcus. But if you'd like, we could arrange for you to visit with her again tomorrow. Would you like that?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically, then did something that brought tears to everyone's eyes. He carefully approached Bella and gave her a gentle hug around her neck. "Thank you for being my friend," he whispered into her golden fur. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chun pulled Eleanor aside. "This is the breakthrough we needed," he said. Quietly, Marcus is communicating again, showing trust, engaging with his environment. Bella has given him back something the trauma took away, the feeling that the world can be a safe place. Eleanor watched her grandson wave goodbye to Bella, his face bright with genuine happiness for the first time in weeks. Do you think he might be able to help with the case now?" Dr. Chun chose his words carefully. "We're not there yet. He's still not ready to discuss the traumatic event itself. But this is progress, real, measurable progress. With time and patience, Bella might help him find the courage to face those difficult memories. As they drove home through the late afternoon sunshine, Marcus chattered excitedly about Bella's tricks, her soft fur, and her gentle brown eyes. Eleanor felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time since that terrible morning on Maple Street. Neither of them noticed the black sedan that followed them home, or the cold eyes watching from behind tinted windows as Raymond Hayes made note of their license plate number. The morning air outside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse buzzed with an electricity that only comes when a case captures the public's imagination. News vans lined East Lakeside Avenue, their satellite dishes reaching toward the cloudy sky like technological prayers. Reporters clutched steaming coffee cups and checked their equipment one final time, preparing for what many were calling the most unusual trial of the decade. Inside the imposing limestone building, Courtroom 4A had been transformed into something resembling a media circus. The gallery was packed to capacity with journalists, legal observers, child advocacy groups, and curious citizens who had followed the story of the 3-year-old witness and his therapy dog companion. Judge Robert Coleman surveyed the crowded room from his bench, his weathered face betraying none of the nervousness he felt about the unprecedented proceedings he was about to oversee. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Patricia Huang adjusted her navy blue suit jacket and reviewed her opening statement one final time. Beside her, Prosecutor Amanda Torres organized her files with methodical precision, though her hands trembled slightly with pre-trial nerves. This case would define both their careers, either as the team that brought justice to David Martinez and his family, or as the prosecutors who let a violent criminal walk free because they couldn't get a toddler to testify. Across the aisle, defense attorney Michael Crawford exuded confidence in his expensive charcoal gray suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture relaxed and commanding. He had built his reputation on dismantling prosecution cases, and he was particularly skilled at casting doubt on witness testimony. A 3-year-old's account of events? He almost pitied the prosecution for hanging their case on something so flimsy. But it was the defendant himself who drew the most attention in the courtroom. Raymond Hayes sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting brown suit, his massive frame barely contained by the wooden chair. The man who had seemed so menacing wielding a metal pipe now appeared almost diminished in the formal court setting, though his cold eyes still held the predatory intelligence that had made him dangerous on the streets. In the third row of the gallery, Eleanor Thompson sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, wearing the navy dress she had worn to her husband's funeral 5 years earlier. Beside her, Marcus fidgeted in his best clothes, a white button-down shirt, navy slacks, and tiny dress shoes that he kept kicking against the wooden bench. But what made this gallery unusual was the golden retriever lying calmly in the aisle beside their pew. Bella wore her official courthouse vest, a blue fabric harness that identified her as a working facility dog. Her training was evident in every aspect of her behavior. She remained perfectly still despite the crowd, the noise, and the overwhelming sense of the packed courtroom. Officer Maria Santos sat behind Eleanor and Marcus, ready to intervene if Bella was needed for emotional support. The transformation in Marcus over the past month had been remarkable. The boy who had once hidden under beds and refused to speak now chatted quietly with his grandmother, occasionally reaching down to pat Bella's head. Dr. Chun, observing from a few rows back, noted how Marcus's entire demeanor changed when his hand made contact with the dog's fur. His breathing steadied, his shoulders relaxed, and the hypervigilant scanning of his environment decreased markedly. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the packed courtroom rose as one. Judge Coleman took his seat and surveyed the room with the authority of 4 decades on the bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "we are here today for the trial of Raymond Hayes, charged with aggravated assault in the attack on David Martinez. Before we begin, I want to address the unusual circumstances of this case. He paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the gallery. This court has approved the presence of a facility dog to assist a young witness. I want to be absolutely clear. Bella is here solely to provide emotional support. She is not to be considered evidence, and her presence should not influence her deliberations in any way. Is this understood? The jury, 7 women and 5 men of varying ages and backgrounds, nodded solemnly. During voir dire, Torres had been careful to select jurors who seemed open-minded about innovative approaches to justice, while Crawford had focused on those who might view the dog's presence as emotional manipulation. D.A. Hong rose for her opening statement, her voice strong and clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on the morning of March 15, 2023, David Martinez was brutally attacked with a metal pipe, suffering traumatic brain injury that has left him fighting for his life. The defendant, Raymond Hayes, committed this violent act in broad daylight, believing no one was watching. She gestured toward Marcus, and every eye in the courtroom followed her movement. But someone was watching. A 3-year-old boy witnessed this entire attack from his grandmother's front porch. This child saw Raymond Hayes strike David Martinez with such force that blood splattered across the concrete. He saw a man's life nearly ended over a drug debt of less than $200. Crawford objected immediately. Your Honor, the prosecution is presenting facts not yet in evidence. Sustained, Judge Coleman ruled. Ms. Huang, please confine your opening to what you intend to prove. Huang nodded and continued. The evidence will show that Raymond Hayes is responsible for this heinous attack. We will present forensic evidence, witness testimony from responding officers, medical evidence of Mr. Martinez's injuries, and yes, we will hear from the brave little boy who watched this violence unfold. With the help of Bella, his specially trained companion, Marcus Thompson will tell you what he saw that morning. As she spoke, Marcus reached down to pat Bella's head, the simple gesture not lost on the jury. Several jurors watched the interaction with visible emotion, though they tried to maintain professional objectivity. Crawford's opening statement was a masterclass in reasonable doubt. He painted Hayes as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, questioned the reliability of a 3-year-old's memory, and suggested that the prosecution was so desperate for a conviction they were resorting to courtroom theater with therapy. Dogs. Ladies and gentlemen, Crawford said, his voice rich with implied skepticism, you cannot convict a man based on the confused recollections of a traumatized toddler. Children that age can barely remember what they had for breakfast, let alone accurately recall a violent incident that lasted mere seconds. The prosecution wants you to believe that this child, he gestured dismissively toward Marcus, can provide reliable testimony about events that trained adult investigators struggle to reconstruct. As the day progressed, the prosecution called their first witness as Officer James Rodriguez, who had responded to the 911 call, and paramedic Linda Chun, who had treated Martinez at the scene. Their testimony painted a vivid picture of the attack's aftermath. Martinez unconscious and bleeding profusely, evidence of blunt force trauma, blood spatter patterns consistent with a pipe-like weapon. Throughout the testimony, Marcus sat quietly in the gallery, occasionally whispering questions to his grandmother or reaching down to touch Bella. The dog remained perfectly calm, her training evident in how she ignored the legal proceedings while staying alert to Marcus's emotional state. The day's final witness was Dr. Sarah Kim, the neurosurgeon who had operated on Martinez. Her testimony was devastating severe traumatic brain injury, multiple skull fractures, and brain swelling that had required emergency surgery to save his life. Even if Martinez survived, she explained, he would likely suffer permanent cognitive impairment. The force required to cause this kind of damage Dr. Kim testified, would be consistent with being struck by a heavy, cylindrical object, something like a metal pipe wielded with significant force. Crawford's cross-examination focused on the possibility that Martinez's injuries could have resulted from other causes, perhaps a fall, or being struck by a different type of object. But Dr. Kim's testimony remained unshaken. The injury pattern was consistent with being struck by a pipe-like weapon. As court adjourned for the day, the media swarmed the courthouse steps. Legal experts offered opinions on everything from the admissibility of child testimony to the precedent in setting use of therapy dogs in criminal proceedings. But inside the courthouse, the real drama was just beginning. Marcus had made it through his first day in the courtroom without a breakdown, largely thanks to Bella's calming presence. But tomorrow would bring more challenging testimony, and eventually, the prosecution would call upon the 3-year-old to tell his story. In his cell that night, Raymond Hayes lay awake, thinking about the little boy in the courtroom, the boy whose testimony could send him to prison for 15 years. The child who had seemed so small and fragile, yet who had somehow found the strength to survive in a world that had shown him violence too early. Hayes had underestimated many things in his criminal career, but as he stared at the ceiling of his jail cell, he realized his biggest mistake might have been underestimating the power of a 3-year-old's memory and the golden retriever who had helped him find his voice again. The courtroom felt different on the 7th day of testimony. The usual morning chatter was subdued, replaced by an almost reverent quiet that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was about to unfold. Today, Marcus Thompson would take the witness stand if he could manage it. The past week had built toward this moment with the methodical precision of a master chess game, each piece of evidence carefully placed to support what everyone hoped would be the prosecution's decisive move. Eleanor Thompson had barely slept. The night before, she'd found Marcus at 3 a.m., standing at his bedroom window, staring out at the street where the attack had occurred, Bella's favorite tennis ball clutched in his small hands. "Grandma," he had whispered, "what if I forget the words when I have to talk to all those people?" "You just tell them what happened, sweetheart," she had replied, though her own voice trembled with uncertainty. "Bella will be right there with you." Now, as they sat in their usual spot in the 3rd row, Marcus wore his lucky Superman t-shirt under a navy blazer that Eleanor had bought specially for this day. His small legs swung nervously from the bench, his dress shoes catching the morning light filtering through the tall courtroom windows. Beside him on the floor, Bella maintained her perfect composure, though Officer Maria Santos noticed the dog's increased alertness, her ears slightly more perked, her breathing a fraction faster, as she sensed the tension radiating from her young charge. At the prosecution table, Amanda Torres reviewed her notes one final time, though she had memorized every question, every potential redirect, every possible objection Crawford might raise. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It was about whether a traumatized 3-year-old could find the courage to speak his truth in a room full of strangers. The weight of David Martinez's shattered life, of his family's desperate need for justice, of the precedent this case would set for countless future victims, all of it rested on the tiny shoulders of a little boy who still sometimes hid under his bed when thunder rumbled. Defense attorney Crawford had spent the morning trying to suppress his growing anxiety. His usual pre-testimony confidence felt forced today, undermined by a week of watching Marcus interact with Bella in the gallery. The child's remarkable recovery from selective mutism was undeniable, and Crawford had seen enough juries to know that the sight of a brave 3-year-old testifying with his therapy dog would be emotionally compelling regardless of the actual content of his words. Judge Coleman called the court to order with unusual solemnity. "Miss Torres, please call your next witness." "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Marcus Thompson." The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft sound of Marcus's shoes against the marble floor, as Eleanor walked him toward the front of the room. Each step seemed to echo with impossible loudness, and Marcus's grip on his grandmother's hand tightened with every forward movement. When they reached the witness area, Officer Santos stepped forward with Bella, who immediately positioned herself beside the child-sized chair that had been specially arranged near the witness stand. Marcus looked impossibly small as he climbed into the chair, his feet dangling several inches from the floor. The court reporter adjusted her position to better hear his quiet voice, while the jury leaned forward almost unconsciously, drawn by the vulnerable courage of this tiny witness. Bella settled beside him with practiced grace, her golden fur almost glowing in the courtroom's fluorescent lighting. "Hi, Marcus," Torres said gently, approaching the witness stand with the careful movements of someone who understood that she was dealing with spun glass. "Can you tell us your name?" "Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around the packed courtroom, taking in the sea of adult faces all focused intently on him. His breathing quickened, and his small hand reached down to touch Bella's head, a gesture that seemed to steady him slightly. "That's a very nice shirt, Marcus. Is Superman your favorite superhero?" A tiny smile crossed his face. "He's really strong, and he helps people." The answer came more easily, and Torres felt a flutter of hope. "That's wonderful. Marcus, do you remember staying at your grandmother's house a few months ago?" "Yes, Grandma makes the best pancakes. And she lets me watch cartoons before breakfast." His voice grew stronger as he talked about familiar, happy things. Torres spent the next 20 minutes building rapport, asking about Marcus's favorite toys, his pet goldfish named Bubbles, his mother's work at the hospital. The jury watched this careful dance between prosecutor and child, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just legal testimony, but a masterclass in helping a traumatized child find his voice. But as Torres began to approach the difficult questions about that March morning, about what he had seen from the porch, Marcus's demeanor began to change. His answers became shorter, more hesitant. His free hand began to twist the fabric of his blazer, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. "Marcus, do you remember playing with your blocks on your grandmother's porch?" Torres asked gently. The change was immediate and heartbreaking. Marcus's face went pale, and he pressed himself back into the chair as if trying to disappear. His eyes, which had been making tentative contact with Torres, now stared fixedly at the floor. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Judge Coleman had to ask him to repeat himself. "I was building the biggest tower," Marcus whispered, but the joy had drained from his voice entirely. Torres continued with infinite patience, but each question seemed to push Marcus further into himself. When she asked about seeing people across the street, he began to shake visibly. His small hand clutched Bella's fur like a lifeline, but even the dog's presence seemed insufficient against the weight of the memories Torres was asking him to confront. "Marcus, did you see two men talking across the street?" Torres asked, her voice as gentle as a mother's lullaby. I done single quotes T. Marcus's voice trailed off completely. His breathing became labored, and tears began to form in his dark eyes. The courtroom watched in painful silence as the little boy who had seemed so brave just moments before began to crumble under the weight of trauma and fear. Crawford half rose from his chair, ready to object to continuing the questioning, but something in Judge Coleman's expression made him pause. The veteran judge had seen many difficult testimonies, but the sight of a 3-year-old battling his own terrified memories struck him with unexpected force. Torres knelt beside Marcus's chair, bringing herself to his eye level. "Marcus, you're safe here. No one can hurt you. Bella is right here with you, and your grandma is right there in those chairs. You're the bravest little boy I know." But Marcus was beyond words now, lost in the grip of a trauma response that made his small body tremble like a leaf in a storm. He slipped from the chair and sank to the floor beside Bella, wrapping his arms around her neck and burying his face in her golden fur. The courtroom held its collective breath as they watched this tiny figure seek comfort from the only source that had proven reliable, his four-legged friend who asked nothing of him except to trust her steady presence. "I can't," Marcus sobbed into Bella's fur, his words muffled but audible in the absolute silence of the courtroom. "I can't talk about the bad man. It makes the scary feelings come back." Judge Coleman called for a 15-minute recess, his voice gentle but firm. As court officers cleared the spectators and jury from the room, Torres remained kneeling beside Marcus, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Dr. Chun hurried forward to assess the situation, while Eleanor Thompson watched from the gallery with her heart breaking for her beloved grandson. The question that hung in the air was the same one that had plagued the case from the beginning. Could a 3-year-old find the strength to face his demons for the sake of justice? And if he couldn't, would Raymond Hayes walk free, his violent crime unpunished, while David Martinez lay in a hospital bed with permanent brain damage? As Marcus clung to Bella in the empty courtroom, whispering words only she could hear, the answer seemed as fragile and uncertain as the little boy himself. The moment of truth had arrived, but truth, it seemed, was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The 15-minute recess stretched into 30 minutes as Dr. Chun worked with Marcus in Judge Coleman's chambers. Through the heavy oak door, muffled voices could be heard, the gentle tones of adults trying to coax a traumatized child back from the edge of psychological collapse. In the main courtroom, spectators whispered among themselves. Reporters frantically typed updates on their phones, and the jury sat in an adjacent room, wrestling with what they had just witnessed. Raymond Hayes remained at the defense table, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching panic. The sight of Marcus breaking down had initially filled him with relief. Surely no jury would convict based on the testimony of a hysterical 3-year-old. But Crawford's expression suggested the situation was more complex than Hayes understood. The defense attorney had seen enough trials to recognize that sometimes a witness's visible trauma could be more compelling than the most articulate testimony. "This could work in our favor," Crawford muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The kid's clearly too traumatized to provide reliable testimony. Hayes wasn't so sure. He'd been watching the jury's faces during Marcus's breakdown, and what he'd seen wasn't skepticism about the child's credibility. It was compassion, anger, and a growing determination to protect the vulnerable witness, who was fighting so hard to tell his story. In the judge's chambers, Eleanor Thompson held her grandson while Dr. Chun spoke in soothing tones. Marcus had stopped crying, but he remained curled against his grandmother's chest, occasionally peeking out to look for Bella, who lay nearby with Officer Santos's gentle hand on her head. "I don't think he can do it," Eleanor whispered to Dr. Chun, her own eyes red with tears. "I can't watch him suffer like this." "Maybe we should just wait," Dr. Chun interrupted softly. He had been observing Marcus carefully throughout the crisis, and he'd noticed something significant. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" The little boy lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes still bright with tears. "When you were upset just now, what did you tell Bella?" Marcus glanced at the golden retriever, then back at Dr. Chun. "I told her about the scary man and how he hurt the other man. Bella's a good listener." Dr. Chun exchanged glances with Officer Santos, both of them recognizing the same possibility. "Marcus, you know how sometimes it's easier to tell Bella things than to tell grown-ups?" Marcus nodded emphatically. "Bella doesn't ask scary questions. She just listens with her heart." Judge Coleman, who had been quietly observing from behind his desk, leaned forward. "Dr. Chun, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" With the court's permission, Dr. Chon said carefully. Perhaps Marcus could share his story with Bella, rather than with the courtroom directly. We've seen how effectively he communicates with her when he doesn't feel pressure to perform for adults. The unconventional request sent Torres and Crawford into hurried consultations with their legal teams. The precedent would be unprecedented, allowing a child witness to testify by speaking to his therapy dog rather than directly answering questions. But as Judge Coleman pointed out, the goal was to obtain truthful testimony while protecting the witness from additional trauma. We'll try it, Coleman decided, but with strict parameters. Mr. Crawford, you'll have the same opportunity for cross-examination, though obviously we'll need to adapt the procedures. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had leaked about the unusual approach being attempted, and legal experts in the gallery were already debating the implications for future cases involving child witnesses. The jury filed back in with visible concern for Marcus, several of them looking directly at the small figure sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Bella. Judge Coleman addressed the courtroom with unusual gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to proceed in a manner that is unusual, but not without precedent in other jurisdictions. A witness will be permitted to share his account by speaking to his therapy dog. Bella, I want to emphasize that this accommodation is being made solely to protect the psychological well-being of a traumatized child witness. Torres approached Marcus slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, would you like to tell Bella about that morning when you were building your tower? Marcus looked up at her with wide eyes, then at Bella, who seemed to sense the shift. In energy, the dog positioned herself more deliberately beside him, her intelligent eyes focused entirely on the child. Bella, Marcus began, his voice so quiet that the court reporter had to adjust her equipment. Do you remember? I told you about the day the bad thing happened? The courtroom was so silent that the whisper of the ventilation system seemed loud. Every person present leaned forward unconsciously, straining to hear the words that would determine the fate of both victim and defendant. Marcus reached out and gently stroked Bella's ears, the familiar gesture seeming to give him strength. I was making the biggest tower ever, and you would have liked it, Bella. It had all the colors red and blue and green. His voice grew stronger as he settled into the rhythm of talking to his trusted friend. Then the loud voices started, and I looked up from my blocks. There were two men by the big building across the street, and they were really angry with each other. Torres held her breath, not daring to interrupt as Marcus found his own way into the painful memory. The big man had on a red jacket, just like the fire trucks we saw at the parade, Bella. He was yelling at the other man, the one in the blue shirt who looked scared. Marcus's voice remained steady as he spoke to Bella, but his small hand trembled slightly as it rested on her fur. The scared man was trying to back away, but the big man followed him. And then Marcus paused, his breathing quickening, but he looked into Bella's patient brown eyes and seemed to find the courage to continue. The big man reached behind his back and pulled out a long metal stick, kind of like the one Grandpa used to fix the fence, but shinier. He held it up high. Bella, like he was going to hit something really hard. The jury sat transfixed, several members fighting back tears as they watched this brave little boy navigate his trauma through his connection with his canine companion. Then he brought the stick down on the scared man's head, Bella, and there was a terrible sound like when I dropped Grandma's coffee mug on the kitchen floor, but much worse. And red stuff came out of the man's head and got all over the ground. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on, his words flowing now with a clarity that stunned everyone present. The man fell down and didn't get back up, Bella. He was very still, like when we play sleeping lions, but this wasn't a game. And then the big man looked around, and he saw me watching from Grandma's porch. The moment Marcus had been building to arrived with devastating simplicity. He turned slightly toward the defense table, his young eyes finding Raymond Hayes with unerring accuracy. "That man right there, Bella," Marcus said, pointing directly at Hayes with a small finger that never wavered. "That's the big man with the red jacket. He's the one who hurt the other man with the metal stick." He looked at me after he did it, and his eyes were really scary, like he was angry that I saw what he did. The courtroom erupted in barely contained gasps and whispers, before Judge Coleman restored order with a sharp rap of his gavel. But the damage to Hayes's case was already done. The 3-year-old's account, delivered with the innocent precision that only children possess, had provided details that perfectly matched the physical evidence presented earlier in the trial. Hayes himself sat frozen at the defense table, his face pale with the recognition that his carefully constructed defense was crumbling around him. The child he had dismissed as an unreliable witness had just delivered the most damning testimony of the entire trial. Marcus continued speaking to Bella, describing how he had run inside to hide, how the sirens had come, how he hadn't been able to stop thinking about the hurt man. But the crucial damage was done. In the space of 10 minutes, speaking to his beloved therapy dog rather than to the intimidating adults around him, Marcus Thompson had provided the testimony that would send Raymond Hayes to prison. Crawford's cross-examination was gentle but futile. Every attempt to shake Marcus's account only reinforced its consistency and credibility. The child's memory, protected and preserved by his bond with Bella, proved to be as reliable as any adult witness, perhaps more so, because it was unfiltered by adult assumptions or motivations. As the session concluded, Marcus looked up at Torres with eyes that seemed older than his years. "Is the hurt man going to be okay now?" he asked. Torres knelt beside him, her own eyes bright with tears of relief and admiration. "Because of your courage, Marcus, we can make sure the man who hurt him faces the consequences of what he did. You were very, very brave." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in the courtroom, and hugged Bella tightly. "Bella helped me find the brave words," he said simply. In that moment, everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. The power of unconditional love to heal trauma, a strength that can emerge from the most vulnerable witnesses, and the remarkable bond between a child and his four-legged guardian angel who had helped him find his voice in the pursuit of justice. The jury deliberation room on the 3rd floor of the Cuyahoga County Courthouse had seen its share of difficult decisions over the years, but few cases had affected the 12 citizens as profoundly as this one. Foreman Robert Martinez, no relation to the victim, sat at the head of the rectangular table, watching his fellow jurors process what they had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. The image of 3-year-old Marcus Thompson speaking to his golden retriever companion would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "I've never seen anything like that child's testimony," said juror number 7, Patricia Williams, a kindergarten teacher who had been visibly moved by Marcus's courage. "The way he was able to tell his story to that dog when he couldn't face us directly. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time." Juror number 3, Michael Chun, a retired engineer, nodded gravely. The details he provided matched every piece of physical evidence we heard. The blood spatter patterns, the type of weapon, the victim's position when he fell. A 3-year-old doesn't fabricate that kind of precise information. The deliberation took exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. News crews had maintained their vigil outside. Legal experts continued their commentary, and victim advocacy groups held prayer circles on the courthouse steps. Inside courtroom 4A, every seat was filled, every breath held in collective suspense. Eleanor Thompson sat in her usual spot with Marcus beside her, the little boy now wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt and clutching a new toy car, gift from Officer Santos and Bella, The therapy dog lay at his feet, her presence as calming and steady as it had been throughout the trial. Marcus had asked that morning if Bella could come home with them after the important meeting, not fully understanding that this was the day that would determine whether the man who haunted his dreams would go to prison. At the defense table, Raymond Hayes sat rigid in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man watching his freedom slip away. Crawford had done his best with an impossible case, but even he knew that Marcus's testimony, delivered with the pure honesty that only children possess, had been devastating to their defense. Judge Coleman called for order as the jury foreman stood. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The envelope passed between bailiff, judge, and foreman seemed to carry the weight of months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and one little boy's incredible courage. Judge Coleman read the verdict silently, his weathered face revealing nothing, before handing it back to the foreman. "Will the defendant please rise?" Hayes struggled to his feet, his massive frame somehow diminished by the formal proceedings that were about to seal his fate. "On the charge of aggravated assault in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman's voice rang clear through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant, Raymond Hayes, guilty." The word guilty seemed to echo through the room like thunder. In the gallery, Eleanor Thompson closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude, while Marcus looked up at her with confusion about why all the adults seemed so emotional. David Martinez's wife, Carmen, broke into tears of relief from her wheelchair-accessible seat near the front, the first time she had smiled since that terrible March morning. Hayes's knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the defense table for support. 15 years to life. That's what Crawford had warned him to expect. 15 years away from the streets, where he had built his reputation through violence and intimidation. Judge Coleman's sentencing 3 weeks later was swift and decisive. The courtroom was again packed, but this time the atmosphere was one of closure rather than anticipation. Hayes received 14 years in state prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crime and the extraordinary circumstances of the case that had brought him to justice. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Coleman said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the bench, "your actions on March 15th changed many lives forever. You left David Martinez with permanent brain damage that will affect him and his family for the rest of their lives. But perhaps most tragically, you inflicted psychological trauma on a 3-year-old child who did nothing more than play innocently on his grandmother's porch." He paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the gallery, who was quietly showing Bella a picture he had drawn of the two of them playing fetch. "However," Coleman continued, "this case has also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the power of innovative, therapeutic approaches to help trauma victims find their voice. The courage shown by young Marcus Thompson, supported by his therapy dog Bella, has not only brought you to justice, but has set a precedent that will help other vulnerable witnesses for years to come." The impact of the case extended far beyond that Cleveland courtroom. Within 6 months, Ohio had passed legislation formally recognizing the use of facility dogs for traumatized witnesses. The Marcus Thompson Act became a model for other states, and Bella found herself something of a celebrity in the victim services community, her photograph appearing in training manuals and legal journals across the country. But the most important transformation was in Marcus himself. By the start of autumn, the little boy who had once hidden under beds and refused to speak had blossomed into a chatty, confident kindergartner. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, noted in her reports that Marcus was particularly kind to classmates who seemed scared or upset, as if his own experience with trauma had given him an unusual capacity for empathy. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of playing fetch with Bella in endless green fields. He still visited her once a week at the Family Advocacy Center, their bond as strong as ever, though now their time together was filled with laughter and games rather than therapeutic necessity. David Martinez had awakened from his coma in June, though the brain damage had left him with significant cognitive impairments. He would never be the same man who had walked across that street on that March morning, but his family was grateful to have him alive. When Carmen Martinez met Eleanor Thompson at a victim support group meeting, the two women embraced like old friends, united by their shared experience of watching loved ones suffer and heal. On a crisp October afternoon, exactly 7 months after Marcus had first met Bella, Eleanor found her grandson in the backyard, building an elaborate city with his blocks. But instead of the solitary play that had characterized his early childhood, he was now narrating an elaborate story for his stuffed animals, assigning each of them roles in his imaginary world. "And this is where the brave dog lives, Marcus," explained to his teddy bear audience, placing a small yellow block with particular care. "She helps children when they're scared, and she has the softest fur in the whole world, and she never, ever gets mad at anyone." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the influence that Bella had had on her grandson's understanding of courage, compassion, and healing. The golden retriever had given Marcus more than just the ability to testify. She had given him a model for how to be brave, how to help others, and how to trust that the world could be a safe place again. As the sun set behind the autumn trees, Marcus continued building his block city, no longer haunted by memories of violence, but instead inspired by dreams of a world where scared children could always find a gentle friend to listen to their stories. In his innocent architecture, justice and healing lived side by side, protected by the enduring love between a little boy and his four-legged guardian angel. The case of the state of Ohio v. Raymond Hayes had officially closed, but its legacy would continue in every courthouse where therapy dogs helped vulnerable witnesses find their voice, in every child who learned that trauma could be overcome with patience and love, and in the enduring bond between a brave little boy named Marcus and a golden retriever named Bella, who had shown him that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from speaking to a room full of strangers, but from whispering the truth to a friend who listens with her heart.